Society. This is projection number 10 for the U.S. 2024 presidential election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. So today I'm introducing a revision to my original model to determine, based on actual votes, who is likely to win the election. And I've broken it down by essentially the number of votes or registrants, that is, those registered by a particular party, whether it be Dem or GOP or other independent, that showed up in each of the battleground states during the 2020 election. And those battleground states include Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and I've also included Iowa. Now, once I have that data, that I'm using that specific data to compare it to how many people have come out to vote thus far for the 2024 election. And I'm getting that data from the website NBC News Decision 2024. You can see here that roughly 56 million plus mail-in and early in-person votes have been cast nationally thus far. You can go on to each one of the states to see how many in that state have voted. For example, in Texas, so far we've had a total of 6.891 million votes mailed in or in person early. And of those, it also breaks it down by party affiliation. For example, here, for the state of Texas, 37% of the 6.8 million have come from Democrats, 52% from GOP, and you can't see here where it's cut off, but far over to the right, 11% from independent and other. So I've taken that data along with data from the website TargetSmart to determine by each of the states. For example, here we have North Carolina, what percentage came out. In this case, it's modeling the party based on 2020 results. And in 2020, 71.6% of Democrats came out to vote in North Carolina, where 79.5% of Republicans came out to vote, and then 68.3% of the unaffiliated came out to vote. That then is the base by which we're using to determine what percentage of this total have showed up so far in 2024. And that lets us know the early vote, whether it be by absentee, mail-in, or in-person early. Then we subtract that from 100%, and we're modeling what we're expecting the percentage by each of the parties or affiliations to come out on election day. We then add up the total votes to get a total. In addition to that, we're including independent vote and GOP vote. And you can see here I've broken it down 50% to Dems and 50% to GOP. But we're not going to be doing this as you see these numbers, because that's not realistic. But instead we'll be using this website, CNN's political website, and go to each of the states to get exit polls for the year 2020 to see what percentage of independents voted for Democrats versus Republican. And then also we'll be determining what percentage of the GOP vote went over to the Dems and got subtracted from the GOP total. Donald Trump does have a little bit of a drag from each of his presidential elections. So I'll be expecting that because it's consistent through history. Again, we're using consistent data from history, not polling, which we find often influenced by bias and very off in terms of the outcomes when it comes to what we find following election day. So now let's take a look at our spreadsheet to take a look at how all the math comes together. And you'll see here again, in 2020, of 100% registered voters in Texas, 60.4% showed up to vote. And of that 64.4%, you can see that 63% of Democrats showed up to vote, which accounted for 4.3 million votes. In the state of Texas, where 75% of the GOP showed up to vote, with about 5.5 million votes cast. And then about 63% of independents showed up to vote. That's 1.4 million votes. And then altogether, adding these in Texas in 2020 during the presidential election, over 11 million votes were cast. So we get all of that data, and then we bring it down and compare it to, again, the number of votes actually cast in that state. And in this case, over 6.8 million have voted in the state of Texas thus far by mail, absentee, or early in person. And 37% of those, and I put that here in the pink, you can see the total here. And then you can see also the percentage of 2020's total. 61.61% of the total votes showing up so far in the state of Texas, of that 60.4%. So roughly about, 37, 38% of the total number of voters that are eligible to vote in Texas have showed up so far early to vote. Now, then it breaks it down by party affiliation. Again, you can see that of that 6.8 million, 37% have come from Dems, 52% from GOP, and about 11% from independents. Then each of these add up for total vote. And you see already that matches what we see here on NBC's decision website. So we do that for each one of the states. And then we take that amount. In this case, we go down to this next section, and you see that in the state of Texas, what percentage of the vote is Democrat that showed up comparative to 2020. So, in other words, in 2020, in the state of Texas, 63% of Democrats showed up to vote. And only 37% of Dems, but so far, there have been a total of 6.8 million compared to 11.1 million. And then, so that gives us a total, I guess, multiplier. In this case, it would be roughly 61%. So we take that 61%, multiply it by the 63%, and we get a total percentage of Dems that have so far showed up. And we've done the same for GOP and the independents in each one of the states. And so that then gives us a multiplier. And we get this multiplier, 1.41, because it's adding the total number of votes cast so far, plus the number of votes we're expecting. In other words, another 41% of the 100%, and we're assuming that the same number of people will vote that came out in 2020 in 2024. The only difference here would be the numbers that actually vote either Dem, GOP, and we're assuming that those that vote GOP will vote for Trump in greater numbers, and those for voting Dem will vote for Kamala Harris. So that's where we get our multiplier. For Texas, for example, 59% of 2020's votes have showed up so far. That's among Dems. So we expect 41% on election day. That's if election were held tomorrow. And then the same for GOP. Since 65% have showed up thus far, we expect 35% remaining to show up on election day if it were held tomorrow. But you can see already that this is quite a large lead. That in the state of Texas, you have 3.5 million coming from GOP and 2.5 million from Dem. That's almost a million, over a million votes in favor of Donald Trump in the state of Texas so far. And that 11% is not going to be enough to make a difference. You can see 52% of the votes so far coming of the total going to Donald Trump and 37% going to Kamala Harris. That's if we're presuming that all GOP votes will go to Trump and all Dem votes will go to Kamala Harris. Now, if we only compare Dem and GOP votes, clearly Donald Trump will get the state of Texas. But we're not stopping there, because once we get our total, again, another 41% of Dems will show up, whereas another 35% of GOP will show up. Why? Because more GOP have showed up early than have Dems in the state of Texas during the 2024 election thus far, which is kind of surprising. That's a flip from what we saw previously, where it was more likely that Dems would show up early and then GOP later. Now, then, of course, with our multipliers, and the same thing goes for independent, we get a multiplier. And from there, what our multiplier does, it then determines, excuse me, let me get this here. Here's the multiplier for independent. And then from there, what we do is we go down to the next section and we get a projected vote. Essentially what happens is we take the number of votes that were cast in the early vote, and then we multiply that by the 41% and add those two together to get how many Dems we're projected to vote in the state of Texas. In this case, we're presuming for Kamala Harris, and the same for Donald Trump. Now, in addition to that, I've created a little calculator over here, and we're going to change the numbers to kind of see how things change up based on what percentage of the independents vote for Kamala versus Trump, and the same for what percentage of GOP vote goes over to Kamala Harris versus what percent stays with Donald Trump. Right now, I've got 100% staying with Donald Trump, and none of those votes going over to Harris. And for independents, I'm splitting it 50-50. We're going to start with that map. So let's look at our first state. In the state of Texas, let's go to our map. You can see that, let me get this thing to work. It doesn't want to go for me. In the state of Texas, you can see that 56.5% of the vote is expected for Donald Trump as it stands right now, and then 43.5% is expected for Kamala Harris. That's if there were no, if we split the independent vote and none of the GOP's vote went over to Harris, or none of the Harris's vote went over to Donald Trump. So let's go ahead and make that pink. So that's 183 for Donald Trump versus Harris's 226. Move on down to Florida. You can see 45.4% is expected to go to Harris and 54.6% going to Donald Trump. And I'm adding these up as though they cumulatively come up to 100%, and I do realize that's not going to be the case. There's definitely going to be a certain percentage will go to others, for example, Jill Stein or any other kinds of leftover votes. But as it stands today, if we didn't do anything but split the independent votes 50-50, we would expect that Donald Trump would pick up Florida. So it puts him 213 to Harris's 226. Move on down to Iowa. So far, 415,000 votes have been cast, and 50% of those we're expecting, when it's all done, we're expecting Iowa to go to Kamala Harris. So that's a bit of a surprise, right? So that brings us to 232 to Trump's 213. And you can see that so far, in Iowa, about, what is it? There we go. Let's go up here to Iowa. About 20% of the vote has showed up. So there's still an 80% of registrants, all registrants, could still vote. And you can see 42% have come from Dems and 39% from GOP. And that means that we also look at our multiplier in the state of Iowa, and you can see that 71% of Dems have yet to show up. That's if we want the total number to equal how many Dems showed up during the 2020 election. And then 77% remaining from GOP haven't shown up. And 56% have not shown up among independents. So it's very early on. So far, the most of the states are behind. There are a couple of states that are ahead. For example, I think Georgia and North Carolina are two states where early vote is broken records. Let's move on to that state of Georgia. And you can see here that in the state of Georgia, going back down here, we're expecting 2.1 million votes to come from Dem and 2.3 million come from GOP. So Trump's pick up 52.5% to Harris's 47.5%, giving Georgia, bringing the total to 229 to Democrats 232. Moving on to Arizona, using our same model, you can see right now Donald Trump is wiping the floor with 58% of the vote compared to Harris's 42% of the vote. So he picks up Arizona. Now, in that state, you can, again, if you go up here to this section, you can see about 30% of registrants have showed up to vote. 34% of those coming from Dems. So that's a weak showing by Dems. Whereas 53% of GOP have shown up already. So that is comparative to 2024 that showed up. And then 23% of the independents have showed up thus far in the state of Arizona. Moving on to North Carolina, it's very close there. 2.284 million versus 2.347 million. That's a difference of roughly 50-something, 60 million votes, I guess 60 million votes. So Trump is expecting 50.7% of the vote, whereas Harris is expecting 49.3% of the vote. So Trump barely gets that state by 0.6%. What is that? No. Yeah, I guess, what is that? That's more than that. It's 1.4%, which is less. I think that's about equal to what it was in 2020, something close to that. Moving on to the state of Nevada, 48.7% is expecting from Dems with 546,000 votes versus Trump's 575,000 votes with 51.3%. And that brings Nevada into the red for Trump, 262 Trump, and then Harris, 232. So really, Trump only needs to get one more state and he wins the election. That's if the independent vote splits 50-50 and GOP retains, or Trump retains, all of his votes. Now, let's move on to Wisconsin. We're expecting about 1 million votes to come from, or 945,000 to come from Dems, and 784,000 for Donald Trump. If right now in the state of Wisconsin, only 25% have showed up to vote. And you can see that that's 35% from Dem and 23% from GOP. So that's a difference of 11%. That if the GOP shows up on election day, we're expecting, like in this case, if you go to Wisconsin, the percent have showed up so far in the state of Wisconsin compared to 2024 is 38% for Dems and only 16% for GOP. So that's 84% remaining compared to 62% remaining. So I've already factored that multiplier in. Even with that multiplier, Trump doesn't take the state of Wisconsin. That goes over to Harris. So that brings it to 242 to Trump's 262. Then the same goes for Michigan, with 51.1% expected to go to Harris and 48.9% expected to go to Trump. And so that brings it, the 15 over to Harris's column, bring it 257 to 262. And you can see up here, Michigan, half of the Democrats have showed up so far, whereas 41% of GOP have shown up. And we're expecting, even with including 59% remaining GOP shows up to vote for Trump, and then 50% of the remaining Dems show up to vote, it's still not going to be enough for Trump to catch up. There's a difference of about 90,000 votes. And the thing too is that that's if Dems and the 50% of Dems show up, and then the remaining 59% of GOP show up. Now, if none of the Dems show up, which they are in the last two elections, Dems have more likely to do early voting. Well, I take that back. Back in 2020 during COVID. Now, in 2016, that was not the case. GOP was more likely to vote early than was Dems. But, so we don't really know which way this is going to go, but some polling does suggest GOP is more likely to show up later than early. But you can see each state is different. For example, in the state of Michigan, more Dems have showed up so far than have Republicans. So Republicans have a chance on election day to catch up with this 100,000 missing votes to move on past Harris. But as it stands today, if the election were held tomorrow, right now it's 257 Harris. Harris gets Michigan, and 262 Donald Trump. And then finally, in the state of Pennsylvania, you can see only 28% of Dems have showed up. But even more and crazy is only 16% of GOP have showed up, which is quite significant because, again, that 12% difference, even counting that in, Harris walks off with well over 600,000 more votes than Donald Trump using this model, with 61.5% of the votes versus Trump's 38.5% of the vote. Now, I'm just doing the math based on like if, let's say that, well, currently it's only 16% of GOP have showed up to vote. Let's say that the remaining 84% show up. Well, they get additional 915,000 votes. And so we add that to the total. And you can see they were at 496 versus 915. And so that's what we do. And so 72% of 899,000, we add that on to, it comes out to about 600,000. So we add 900,000, 600,000, and that comes out to 1.5 million. Versus GOP has 500,000 votes. 84% of 500,000 votes, I guess, would be, about 400,000 votes. So add 400,000, 500,000, 400,000, so we're looking at 915,000. So you can see why they're lacking here. All right, so that's as it stands. So if this is true, because Harris also picked up Iowa, she does win with more than 270 electoral votes, 276 to 262. And that's if Harris doesn't pick up any of the GOP vote, or she splits the independent vote 50-50 with Donald Trump. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, based up on this website we talked about, we're going to go through each one of the states, and we're going to copy what it looked like in 2020 in terms of how the independent vote split between Trump and Biden, and also how much of the GOP vote went from Trump to Biden. And we're just going to duplicate that and see if it changes our map any. So let's go ahead and first take these out of the various colors, put them back in gray. Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Texas, Arizona, and Nevada. Okay, so let's just go from, let's just start with the state of Texas. So let's take a look at what it looked like for the state of Texas in 2020. So we go to the state of Texas. Let's go down here where it talks about party ID. You can see that in 2020, 51% of independents in the state of Texas voted for Biden. 45% of independents voted for Trump. So let's go ahead and put that in. So we'll do 51% for Dem, 51%, and then 45% for GOP. Also, you can see that Republican, 94% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump, and the remaining 5% voted for, 5% voted for Biden, and then the remaining 1% voted for someone else, right? So then what happens? Does the state of Texas change? No, it does not. It does move it closer. Instead of 1 million votes, now it's down to, looks like about 600,000 votes instead, spread between Harris and Donald Trump. So we can safely say that regardless of what happens, most likely Harris is not going to win the state of Texas unless a lot of votes come in over the next few days before Election Day, or even on Election Day. A lot of them show up unexpectedly. But as it stands, this is not going to happen if the election were held tomorrow. Now, 226 to Harris to 183 Donald Trump. Now let's move on to our next state, and that's the state of Florida. So let's go ahead and do the same thing. Let's look at the state of Florida and see what it looked like in 2020 and apply that to 2024 as a projection. There's that state of Florida, and you go on down to party ID, and you can see 54% of independents voted for Biden versus 43% voted for Trump in 2020. And then we go ahead and take GOP vote. You can see that 93% voted for Donald Trump and 7% for Biden of the GOP. All right, so let's go ahead and apply that. And in the state of Florida then, we're looking over here to see, is that enough for Harris to take that state? No, it's not. Now, it was a difference of about 500,000 votes. Now it's been narrowed down to about 90,000. But it's still not going to be enough. He wins the state barely by 1%. You could see that if we apply 2020's numbers, using this model, if everything looked the same as it did in 2020 and 2024, if Harris performs as well as Biden, and nothing else really changes other than how many Dems show up versus how many GOP show up, which is different from 2020. Looks like less Dems and less GOP so far, except for in the state of Georgia and North Carolina. We would expect that Donald Trump will win Florida by 1%. So that is an improvement over 2020 because more Dems are showing up than GOP so far in the state of Florida. So that's quite interesting. So let's go ahead and give that over to Donald Trump, bringing him 213 versus Harris 226. So we'll move on to our next state, which is the state of Iowa. And you can see already Harris is winning the state of Iowa. Well, you can't apply, these numbers apply to every one of these, so you just have to ignore them until we change the independent GOP vote to reflect what happened in Iowa in 2020. So let's go ahead and go to Iowa. And in 2020, you can see that 50% of independents voted for Biden versus 46% voted for Trump. So let's apply those numbers. And then for Donald Trump, the same thing here. 93% of GOP voted for Trump and 7% voted for Biden. So using those numbers, you can see that if this is the true and everything continues as it is, that will be a surprise upset in the state of Iowa by a good 8%. That's just quite phenomenal. I don't think it's been since Obama that Dems have taken Iowa. Now, again, remember that in Iowa, only 20% have showed up so far, and slightly in favor of Dems. 42% of Dems have showed up compared to 2020, and 39% of GOP have showed up compared to 2020. So there is room for the GOP to catch up there in Iowa. All right, so let's go ahead and give that state to Harris with that 6 electoral votes. And that brings it to 232 to 213. And then moving on to our next state, which is the state of Georgia. And here is where we want to see whether or not, if we apply this, Harris is going to be able to take the state of Georgia. And in the state of Georgia in 2020, it looks like 53% of independents voted for Biden and 44% voted for Donald Trump. So let's go ahead and apply that. And then for GOP, 94% voted for Trump and 6% voted for Biden. And after those numbers, the state of Georgia, 50.7% in favor of Harris. So it flips the state to Trump's 49.7%, meaning she'll win the state by 1.4%. If things look similar, pretty much from here out until throughout Election Day, as it did in 2020, then we expect Georgia to actually go over to Harris. And so that brings it 248 to 213. And it's sputtering, so I'm not going to make these in the proper shades of blue or red. I think you'll understand. All right, now, Arizona, let's go ahead and go and see what happened in 2020 in the state of Arizona. And if we have same numbers that or same kind of ideology voting trends as we did in 2020, where 53%, so 44% for Trump for independent, so same here, and then 90 to 9%, 9% of GOP voted for Biden in 2020. But I'm not expecting that for Arizona this time around. I think a lot of it had to do with Biden and McCain being quite close with one another. Probably will expect a little bit less this time around going over to Harris. But in this case, even with those numbers, even with Dems picking up 53% of the independent and 9% of the GOP, you can see that in the state of Arizona right now, Trump has a comfortable enough lead that even with that differential, she's not going to be able to take that state. Trump has 52.7%, whereas Harris would pick up 47.3%. It's a very comfortable 6% lead. So we'll go ahead and give Arizona over to Donald Trump. 224 to Harris's 248. And then let's go ahead and go to North Carolina and see what happened in 2020. And in the state of North Carolina, you can see that in 2020, under party ID, 50% of independents voted for Biden, 46% for Trump. So let's go ahead and apply that. And under the 96% of Republicans voted for Trump, 4% for Biden. So if we had a similar outcome between Harris and Biden's performances, we would expect that in the state of North Carolina, Kamala Harris would win that state. 51.4% compared to 48.6%. So she'd pick up North Carolina if she performed as well as Biden has, using the current votes that have been cast thus far, comparing the various party affiliations. So 264 to Trump's 224. And we haven't even gotten to the blue wall, so you can see Harris is way ahead. If her performance is as good as Biden's, she's going to pretty much, looks like, have a blowout. Let's go ahead and take a look at Nevada, what happened in 2020. And a lot of that has to do with some of the record voting and the activity of independents moving over to the Democrat side more heavily than toward the GOP side. So looking at the state of Nevada, 50%, so it's the same, 44% for Donald Trump. So we'll change this to 44. And then 94 versus 5. 94% of GOP over to Donald Trump and 5% over to Biden. And using those numbers in the state of Nevada, 51.6% are expected to go to Harris versus 48.4% expected to go to the GOP. So that would bring Nevada over to Harris's column, bringing her to 264 to Donald Trump's 230 or 270. So that's enough for her to win, even without the blue wall. So 270 to 224 Donald Trump. But let's go ahead and complete this exercise, and then we're going to change some of these numbers to a little bit weaker, because I'm expecting that Harris likely will perform a little bit more, not as strongly as Biden did. But I do think that she will pick up a little bit more of the independent vote and a little bit of the GOP, but not as much as Biden had, perhaps. So let's kind of go in the middle and see how the map looks in that case. But let's finish the exercise as though the vote showed up just as it did in 2020. So going over to our next state, which would be the state of Wisconsin. And in the state of Wisconsin, you can see that 54% of the independents voted for Biden and 42% voted for Trump, and 7% of the GOP voted for Biden and 93% voted for Trump. So that brings Wisconsin very comfortably a massive 17% lead in Wisconsin. So GOP have definitely got to show up. But you can see in the state of Wisconsin, 38% of Dems have showed up so far compared to how many showed up in 2020. And only 16% of GOP have showed up. But I've considered that already. Presuming those 84% of GOP show up, it's still not going to be enough. Because, why? Because if you look in the state of Wisconsin, of all the votes, 35% of those have come from Democrats and 23% have come from GOP. And you can see that 38 versus 16% is 21% spread, or 22% spread. And a lot of the independents appear to be going over to Harris's side as well. So Wisconsin clearly is comfortably in Harris's pocket if we were to compare 2020 to 2024 in terms of performance for Harris. So bring 280 to 224. And then moving on to our next state, if we go to the state of Michigan, and Harris has a similar performance, adding in the votes have been cast thus far, we would see that 51% of independents voted for Biden versus 45% have voted for Trump in 2020. And then of the GOP, 6% of the GOP voted for Biden, whereas 94% voted for Donald Trump. And so that brings Michigan 54% of the vote compared to Trump's 46% of the vote. And again, that means very comfortably she takes Michigan. We put that in the blue. Brings it 295 to Trump's 224. And then lastly, in the state of Pennsylvania, let's see what happened in 2020. In the state of Pennsylvania in 2020, 52% of independents voted for Biden versus 44% voted for Donald Trump. And then of the GOP, 8% voted for Biden, whereas 91% voted for Trump. And so this is just a massive blowout, 65% versus 35%. And why is that? Because so far, 28% of all Dems compared to 2020 that showed up have showed up in 2024, whereas only 16% of GOP have showed up so far compared to what showed up in 2024. But even with that differential, again, including the 84% that will vote later, why? Again, because so far 58% of the total votes cast have come from Dems versus only 32% have come from a GOP. So they have a long way to go to catch up in the state of Pennsylvania. Not impossible, as we got about, 5 or 6 days left before the all the numbers are tallied. All right, so that's what it would look like. So let's include that state just to wrap it up here. If Harris were to perform similar to Joe Biden did in 2020, along with the way votes have been cast thus far, we would expect to have 314 electoral votes compared to Donald Trump's 224. Donald Trump picking up the state of Arizona, Harris picking up the state of Iowa and North Carolina, but everything else remaining as it was in 2020. Now, let's go ahead and do one last exercise to see what things would look like if Harris performed not as well as Biden, but she did pick up some of the independent vote. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to simply say that she picks up 52% of the independent vote. Donald Trump picks up 47%, and that's being actually very generous because you can see in almost every one of the states he picked up about anywhere from 42 to 45% of the independent vote. So I'm giving him a good 3% of the independent vote that he didn't get in 2020. So I'll just say I'll even give him an extra one, put him at 48% and Harris at 52%. And let's say that, which of course not 100% is going to go all to Trump and Harris, but I'm just doing this exercise just to kind of reflect what I think more likely will happen. But for GOP, I'm going to say that Donald Trump picks up 95%. Let's say they're a lot more gung-ho this time around than they were last time. And let's say that Harris picks up only 3%. This is kind of what I'm expecting. I'm even going to change this a little bit because I think it's a little bit unrealistic for 100% of the independents to go to either Harris or Trump. So let's just kind of leave it at 52 for Harris and 47 for Trump, even though polling so far suggests that it's closer to 55 to 45%. And again, we're not really using polling, but I'm going to be generous and err toward Harris doing quite a bit more poorly than compared to what Biden did in 2020, adding in how the voting performance has been up to this point, October the 30th, 2024. All right, taking into all of that into account, let's go through each one of our states. All right, so let's start with the state of Texas. Let's go ahead and gray all these out first. Can't get them to gray out. I know what's going on here. My computer's going very slowly here. Or one more state. Okay, we're Iowa. Okay, now we got them all grayed out. Start with Texas. These numbers are just basically what we would expect if Harris picked up 52% independent compared to Trump's 47%, and then Harris picked up 3% of the GOP vote. I'm going to I'm going to say 96% here for Donald Trump. And so let's start out with Texas. We expect 54% to go to Trump and 45.6% to Harris. So that means that the state of Texas clearly would go over to Donald Trump. Let me refresh this. I don't know why it's stuttering. Okay, so 183 to Harris's 242. Moving on to our next state. In the state of Florida, we expect 52.6% to go to Trump and 47.4% to go to Harris. And that means it's 213 to 242. Moving on to Iowa, and even with all of this, we still see Iowa's going to Harris. And again, I think a lot of this is what I call the Walz effect, him being from Minnesota and him being more progressive. Progressive policies really were born in the Midwest. And so this is what you're seeing, I think. All right, moving on to the state of Georgia. We expect 49.4% compared to 50.6%. So it's a difference of about 1.2%. Trump picking up Georgia, 229 to 248. Moving on to Arizona, 44 for Harris versus 56% for Trump. And whatever they've done in Arizona, they've run a really good campaign apparently, because that's quite a difference from 2020. So 240 to 248. Then North Carolina, it looks like Harris is still on track to win that state, 51.3% compared to 48.7%. Oh, okay, I forgot to blue it out, but here it is. So 248 Harris and 240 Donald Trump. Moving on to Nevada, 50.6% expected to go to Harris versus 49.4%. So Harris is on track to win that state barely, but she does win it by about 1.2%, bringing her 254 to Donald Trump's 240. So that brings us to the Midwestern states, starting with Wisconsin. You can see that she picks up 56.5% compared to Trump's 43.5%. So she takes Wisconsin, and going over to Michigan, 53 versus 47 in favor of Harris. And I just think that progressive policies of Walz and Harris pushing them somewhat has helped them pick up the Midwest. And that's why Bernie was so popular in the Midwest and why he won a number of those states, including Michigan, against Clinton. So this is what you're really seeing here, I think. But those policies don't fare as well in the South or the Southwest. They do fare pretty well along the Pacific coast, like California, Nevada, Washington, Oregon. But once you get into Arizona, they start to weaken somewhat. And that's what I think you're seeing here. Biden and McCain being close together, I think, also helped Biden pick up more for Arizona, and why Harris is not as strong in Arizona. Texas did quite a bit better. Again, I don't think progressive policies are very popular. Populist policies, more popular than progressive policies in Texas, and definitely not in Florida. In Georgia, the same thing applies. I think populism more popular than is progressive policies. Now, that's really what I think is allowing Harris to win this. She did an incredible job picking the right VP. The Walz effect, I think, is what is giving her the win and allowing her to waltz her way into the White House. So here, 63% versus 37%. And that's quite tremendous, because it goes to show you how popular progressive policies are in the Midwest. Because there's so many union organizations there, and things like Medicare for All, and people, the bread and butter topics really matter. And you can even see some of that bleeding over, I believe it's in the 2nd District of Nebraska, where an independent is possibly going to win over a GOP. And even maybe 2 districts in Nebraska would be picked up by Dems. I even saw that Kansas, South Dakota were performing a little bit less strongly for the GOP than they did in 2020. And again, I think this has to do with the Walz effect. And I think a little bit of that also goes into North Carolina. A strong ground game, along with Philadelphia and a number of these states like Raleigh, have a strong African American population, and then the governor running for the GOP side also really kind of is hurting the GOP, in my opinion, for Donald Trump. A little bit of a up-ticket effect on that. So that's how it would stand: 298 for Harris versus 240 for Donald Trump, and that's if 52% of the independent vote went for Harris versus 47% went for Trump, and the 3% of the Dems or the GOP vote went to Dem or Harris, and 96% went for Donald Trump. Now this is actually more favorable than was 2020 for Trump, because remember in 2020 Donald Trump had roughly on average about 94% of the vote for all the battleground states, and Dems picked up on average about 4.5% of the vote for independent from the GOP, and for the independents it was 54% in favor of Biden versus only 41% for Donald Trump. So I gave Donald Trump 0.6% and shaved off 2% from Kamala Harris. And even with that, I'm presuming Harris is doing fairly not as well as Biden did. And we still see that Harris picks up most of the electoral votes, 298 to 240. All right, that's where it stands today. Feel free to comment. Let me know if you like this model better than the one we had before. And if you do like this, you want to see how things progress between now and Election Day, be sure to thumbs up and subscribe. Until our next projection, good day.